What would you do if the lunch lady everyone mocked for being too careful was actually a former biochemist whose scientific knowledge stood between your children and disaster? Margaret Thompson had left her career in pharmaceutical research to work in school food service, where students and staff dismissed her rigorous safety protocols as paranoia. When a massive food contamination threatened Roosevelt High, Margaret's chemistry expertise would prove that sometimes the most important scientists are the ones serving lunch. Before we get to this wonderful story, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the story. Margaret had been working in Roosevelt High's cafeteria for 3 years, but she still felt like an outsider among both the students and her fellow staff members. At 52, she looked like any other school lunch lady. Gray hair tucked under a regulation hairnet, sensible shoes for standing on concrete floors all day, and a cheerful demeanor that masked the intellectual frustration she'd learned to suppress. What nobody at Roosevelt High knew was that Margaret Thompson held a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Colorado and had spent 23 years developing pharmaceutical compounds for a major research laboratory. She hadn't chosen to leave her prestigious career. Budget cuts and corporate restructuring had eliminated her position when she was deemed too expensive compared to younger researchers willing to work for lower salaries. School food service had been meant as temporary employment while she searched for another research position. But after 18 months of rejection letters citing her overqualification or thinly veiled age discrimination, Margaret had accepted the reality that her scientific career was over. At least working in the school cafeteria allowed her to use some of her chemistry knowledge, even if it was just ensuring proper food safety and nutritional balance. The students at Roosevelt High had no idea that their lunch lady understood molecular structures and chemical interactions better than their AP chemistry teacher. They saw only an older woman who insisted on washing her hands constantly, who tested food temperatures obsessively, and who kept detailed logs of every ingredient that came through the kitchen. "Mrs. Thompson is so weird," 17-year-old Ashley Martinez had whispered to her friends just the week before. "She acts like serving tater tots is some kind of science experiment." Margaret had overheard the comment but said nothing. She had learned that explaining her background only made people uncomfortable. Staff members either didn't believe her credentials or felt threatened by her education. Students couldn't understand why someone with a doctorate would choose to work in food service. It was easier to let them think she was just naturally cautious, but Margaret's scientific training had never really left her. She couldn't help analyzing the chemical composition of food deliveries, monitoring pH levels, checking for signs of bacterial contamination, and ensuring that preparation methods maintained nutritional integrity. Her colleagues found her thoroughness excessive, but Margaret knew that feeding 2,400 teenagers daily was actually a complex biochemical operation, with numerous potential failure points. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in November when Cisco delivered Roosevelt High's weekly food shipment. Margaret was conducting her usual inspection of incoming ingredients when she noticed something that made her scientific instincts flare with alarm. The dairy products had an unusual sweet smell that didn't belong in fresh milk and cheese. "Hey, Carl," she called to the delivery driver, "what route did these dairy products take to get here?" Carl shrugged, checking his manifest. "Same as always. Denver Dairy Cooperative to our warehouse, then to your school." "Why?" Margaret opened a carton of milk and immediately detected the same sweet odor, now stronger. Her mind raced through chemical possibilities. Ethylene glycol, antifreeze, had a distinctive sweet smell that could easily be masked by dairy products. If the delivery truck had been contaminated somehow, or if there had been cross-contamination at the warehouse— "I need to test this," Margaret said, moving toward the small chemistry kit she kept in her office. "Test what?" asked Janet Rodriguez, the cafeteria manager, approaching with obvious irritation. "Margaret, we've got lunch prep to start. Whatever you're worried about, I'm sure it's fine." Margaret had faced this dismissal countless times over the past 3 years. Her scientific concerns were routinely dismissed as overthinking or paranoia, but this time felt different. The sweet smell was unmistakable, and if she was right about ethylene glycol contamination, they had less than 3 hours before lunch service began. "Janet, I think our dairy products might be contaminated with antifreeze," Margaret said carefully, knowing how her concerns would be received. Janet's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief. Antifreeze? Margaret, that's ridiculous. These products came from our regular supplier with all the proper certifications. You're being paranoid again. I have a chemistry testing kit in my office, Margaret persisted. Let me run a quick analysis to be sure. Absolutely not, Janet replied firmly. We don't have time for your science experiments. Lunch prep starts in 30 minutes and we're already behind schedule. Margaret felt the familiar frustration of having her expertise dismissed, but this time the stakes were potentially life-threatening. If she was right about the contamination, serving dairy products to 2,400 students could result in mass poisoning. Ethylene glycol was lethal in surprisingly small doses, especially to teenagers whose body weight might not be able to process the toxin effectively. Janet, please, Margaret said, her voice taking on an urgency that surprised her supervisor. Give me 15 minutes to test these products. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize and help with prep. But if I'm right— You're not right, Janet interrupted. You're a lunch lady who reads too much and thinks too much. Leave the food safety to the professionals who certified these products. The irony of being told to leave food safety to professionals while holding a PhD in biochemistry wasn't lost on Margaret, but she'd learned not to mention her credentials. Instead, she made a decision that would violate every protocol in the cafeteria operations manual. While Janet and the other workers began lunch preparation, Margaret quietly collected samples of the dairy products and slipped into her small office. From a locked cabinet, she retrieved the portable chemistry testing kit she'd purchased with her own money, a decision that had earned more mockery from her colleagues who couldn't understand why a lunch lady would own scientific equipment. The test results confirmed her worst fears. The milk contained significant levels of ethylene glycol, enough to cause serious poisoning or death if consumed by teenagers. The cheese showed similar contamination levels. Somehow, antifreeze had gotten into the dairy supply chain, and Roosevelt High had received a shipment that could kill dozens of students. Margaret's hands shook as she stared at the test results. She had to stop lunch service immediately, but she knew that her word alone wouldn't be enough. Janet and Principal Walsh would demand proof, and even then, they might not believe her chemistry analysis. She grabbed her cell phone and called the number for the Colorado Department of Public Health, explaining the situation to the emergency response coordinator. Then, she called the Denver Dairy Cooperative directly, insisting on speaking with their quality control manager. "This is Dr. Margaret Thompson," she said, using her professional title for the first time in 3 years. "I'm calling to report potential ethylene glycol contamination in your products delivered to Roosevelt High School this morning." The quality control manager's tone shifted immediately when he heard Dr. Thompson. "Can you describe your testing methodology and results?" Margaret provided detailed chemical analysis that impressed the dairy manager enough to immediately dispatch their own testing team to the school. But by then, lunch service was scheduled to begin in less than an hour. Margaret left her office to find the cafeteria in full preparation mode. Janet was directing workers in setting up serving lines, while students began filtering into the lunchroom for early lunch periods. The contaminated dairy products were being prepared for service to hundreds of unsuspecting teenagers. "Janet, I need you to stop food service immediately," Margaret said, approaching her supervisor with test results in hand. "Margaret, I told you to drop this nonsense," Janet replied without looking up from her clipboard. "Everything is proceeding normally." "I've confirmed ethylene glycol contamination in all dairy products," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in scientific research. "I've contacted public health authorities and the dairy supplier. If you serve this food, students will be poisoned." Janet finally looked up, her expression mixing annoyance with growing alarm. "Margaret, that's a very serious accusation. Do you understand the implications of what you're saying?" "I understand that we have approximately 45 minutes to prevent a mass poisoning event," Margaret replied calmly. "I've run chemical analysis that confirms dangerous levels of antifreeze in our dairy shipment." "Chemical analysis?" Janet's voice rose with disbelief. "Margaret, you're a lunch lady. You don't run chemical analysis." For the first time in 3 years, Margaret decided to reveal her true background. "Actually, I hold a PhD in biochemistry and spent 23 years in pharmaceutical research. I'm qualified to conduct this analysis, and I'm telling you that serving this food will kill students." The cafeteria fell silent as other workers stopped their preparations to listen. Janet stared at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time. "You have a PhD?" Janet asked weakly. "Yes, and right now that PhD is telling me that we need to evacuate this cafeteria and contact emergency services immediately," Margaret replied. "The contamination levels I've detected are lethal." Before Janet could respond, Principal David Walsh entered the cafeteria with his usual brisk efficiency. "Ladies, I just received some very concerning phone calls from the health department and our food supplier. Something about contamination." Margaret stepped forward. "Principal Walsh, I've detected dangerous levels of ethylene glycol in our dairy products. The entire shipment is contaminated with antifreeze." Principal Walsh's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I tested it," Margaret replied simply. "I have the equipment and training to conduct chemical analysis." "Training?" Principal Walsh asked, his voice reflecting the same disbelief that Margaret had encountered from everyone else. "I have a PhD in biochemistry," Margaret said, no longer caring who knew about her background. "I've been monitoring food safety here for 3 years using methods that go far beyond standard protocols. Today, that monitoring potentially saved every student in this school." The next hour passed in a blur of emergency activity. Public health officials arrived to confirm Margaret's findings. The contaminated dairy products were removed and sealed for investigation. The Denver Dairy Cooperative's testing team arrived to conduct their own analysis, which corroborated Margaret's results exactly. "Dr. Thompson," said Dr. Sarah Kim, the public health emergency coordinator, "your chemical analysis was textbook perfect. How long would you estimate before symptoms would have appeared if this food had been consumed?" "Based on the concentration levels and average teenage body weight, I'd estimate 60 to 90 minutes for initial symptoms, with potential fatalities within 3 to 4 hours, Margaret replied, falling back into the scientific language she hadn't used professionally in years. Dr. Kim shook her head in amazement. "You prevented what could have been the worst food poisoning disaster in Colorado school history." As the investigation continued, Margaret learned that a mechanical failure at the dairy processing plant had caused antifreeze from refrigeration systems to leak into the milk supply. The contamination had been systematic, affecting multiple schools across the Denver metro area. Roosevelt High had been the first to detect the problem, entirely because of Margaret's scientific vigilance. Principal Walsh approached Margaret as the emergency teams finished their work. "Dr. Thompson," he said, still struggling with her title, "I owe you an enormous apology. We all do. Why didn't you tell us about your background?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Because people don't expect lunch ladies to have PhDs. I learned that mentioning my credentials made everyone uncomfortable. It was easier to let you think I was just naturally cautious." "But your scientific training, we could have utilized that knowledge," Principal Walsh protested. "How?" Margaret asked with a sad smile. "By making me the school chemist? My position doesn't exist anymore. The food service job was the only work I could find after being laid off for being too expensive and too old." The revelation prompted Principal Walsh to take an unprecedented step. That evening, he called an emergency school board meeting to discuss Margaret's situation and the broader implications of the day's events. "We have a world-class scientist working in our cafeteria," he told the board members, "and we've been treating her like she's overzealous about food safety. Dr. Thompson's expertise saved potentially hundreds of lives today." Board member Patricia Chen raised the obvious question, "What do you propose we do about it?" "I propose we create a new position," Principal Walsh replied. "Director of Food Safety and Nutrition Sciences. Dr. Thompson would oversee not just Roosevelt High, but develop safety protocols for the entire district." The proposal was approved unanimously, but when Principal Walsh offered Margaret the position, her response surprised him. "I appreciate the offer," Margaret said, "but I've learned something important working in the cafeteria. I like feeding students. I like being part of their daily experience, even if they don't realize who I am. What I'd prefer is to keep my current job with some modifications." "Modifications?" Principal Walsh asked. Let me implement proper scientific protocols for food safety across the district while still working as a lunch lady, Margaret explained. Give me the resources to teach other food service workers about chemistry and contamination detection. Make food safety a science-based operation instead of just following standard guidelines. 6 months later, the Margaret Thompson Food Safety Protocol had been adopted by school districts across Colorado and was being studied for national implementation. Margaret still worked the lunch line at Roosevelt High, but now she also traveled to other schools teaching food service workers about chemical analysis and contamination detection. Dr. Thompson changed how we think about school food service, explained Dr. Kim during a conference presentation about the incident. She proved that scientific expertise can emerge in any environment and that the most important safety protocols are often implemented by people who truly understand the science involved. Margaret's students at Roosevelt High had gradually learned about her background, and their respect for the lunch lady with a PhD had become legendary. But what impressed them most wasn't her scientific credentials. It was her dedication to keeping them safe while continuing to serve their meals with the same cheerful efficiency she'd always shown. Dr. Thompson is still weird, Ashley Martinez admitted to her friends. But now we know it's the good kind of weird, the kind that keeps us from getting poisoned. Margaret overheard the comment and smiled. Being called weird by teenagers no longer bothered her. She'd learned that using her scientific knowledge to protect students was more meaningful than any research position she'd ever held. The antifreeze contamination incident had revealed something important about hidden expertise and wasted talent in American workplaces. Margaret's story inspired other institutions to look more carefully at the backgrounds and capabilities of their support staff, leading to discoveries of remarkable skills and knowledge that had been overlooked or dismissed. But for Margaret herself, the most important outcome was simpler. She'd found a way to use her scientific training to make a real difference in young people's lives. Every day, as she served lunch to 2,400 students, she knew that her chemistry knowledge was keeping them safe. The lunch lady, who had once been dismissed as too careful, had proven that careful attention to scientific detail was exactly what schools needed. Her expertise, hidden for years behind a hairnet and apron, had saved lives and revolutionized how America thought about food safety in educational institutions. And every morning, as Margaret conducted her chemical analysis of incoming food supplies, she smiled, knowing that her PhD in biochemistry had found its most meaningful application not in a corporate laboratory, but in a high school cafeteria where keeping students safe was the most important experiment of all. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.